Today's daf we're going to be learning is Chullin daf lamed tet. Today's daf is sponsored by Abby Sasland in honor of the Leffel School Beit Midrash class for completing Masechet Ta'anit this spring. Mazal Tov. Just as you completed Masechet Ta'anit, so may you go on to complete many other Masechet. Really amazing. Okay, not an easy morning for those living in Israel, waking up to sirens or going to sleep with sirens. So wishing everyone safety and besorot tovot. We'll see how this develops. Okay, with that, we're going to get started with the Mishna. So I'm just going to review the Mishna. The Mishna had three positions. Someone who slaughters an animal for Ovei Kochavim, maybe even it's a good point to start now with a Rashi we're going to meet later today. But on today's daf, there's a Rashi toward, I would say, the second third of the page. They're going to make this assumption that it's obvious that slaughtering for idol worship is forbidden. And then they explain, where do we get it from? And they say, this is from a sugya in Avodah Zarah that we learned, that if someone slaughters an animal for idol worship purposes, it's forbidden to benefit from. And that's because there's a pasuk, zivchei metim. It calls them, they ate zivchei metim. This is in Baal Peor. It's a pasuk about Baal Peor, about what happened in the desert. And then it says, why is it called a metim? Just like a mate, just like a person who dies is forbidden to benefit. You can't benefit from a dead person. You also can't benefit from idol worship. Okay, and that's the idea here, that basically idol worship is forbidden to benefit from an animal that was slaughtered for idol worship. Okay, that's the zivchei is slaughtering, metim, they're like the dead, they're forbidden to benefit. So the basis of this Mishnah, that's really the basis of this Mishnah, that if you slaughter an animal for idol worship purposes, it's forbidden to benefit from. And if it's forbidden to benefit from, obviously the shechita is no good. So then we have this machloket, though. Maybe the shechita is good. We saw two opinions that the shechita was good for two different reasons. Okay, Rabbi Eliezer is the simplest, he forbids. What does he say? If you slaughter for an idol worshiper, the assumption is that most idol worshipers slaughter for their gods, and therefore it's going to be forbidden. So number one, he has to say two things to say that. Number one, the assumption is most idol worshippers slaughter animals for idol worship purposes. Number two, you have to say that the intent of the owner of the meat is what's important. Now, the rabbis agree with him that it's the intent of the owner that's important, but the rabbis think, the Tanna Kama position thinks that, we're not going to assume that every idol worshiper, most of their slaughters are for the purposes of idols, for idol worship. No. Most of their slaughters are to eat the meat. There's nothing wrong with slaughtering an animal for a non-Jew. Then Rabbi Yosi comes and makes this kavachomer. He says, what do you mean? When it comes to pigul and the world of sacrifices, in the world of sacrifice, pigul, lishma, where your machshava, your intent is so important, okay? And there, whose intent is important? It's not the owners, like the other one said, right? They claimed in pigul it is the owners. That's what we saw in the Gemara. But he says, no, it's the Kohen. Well, what's the parallel here? If when intent is so important and we don't even care about the intent of the owner, then also here, where intent means nothing, then, which we're going to have to deal with what that means exactly. But right now, we assume, okay, intent means nothing here. Intent is not important. Therefore, for sure, we're not going to take into consideration the intent of the owner. It's only the intent of the slaughterer, and that's a Jew, and therefore, there's no problem. So we have two people who permit, but for completely different reasons. Now, we explained the machloket at the end of yesterday's daf that Tanna Kama would say, though, if you know, this is all because the Tanna Kama says, oh, it's just because we don't assume that they all want to worship idols. But if they tell you, I want to do this for idol worship, it would actually be forbidden, right? Rabbi Eliezer would forbid in any case, and Rabbi Yosi would still say it's permitted because we don't care about the person's intent. Now we're going to have another explanation of the machloket, starting from 3 lines from the bottom of Lamed Chet Amud. Ika da'amre, some people say, they actually, Tanna Kama and Rabbi Eliezer disagree in a case where we know they wanted to do it for idol worship purposes. Now we're going to have a different way of understanding the opinions. Tanna Kama saval, ki amrinan ze mechashev v'ze oved, when we say basically that the intent of the owner is relevant, okay, those are the words, ze mechashev, this one thinks, this one has an intent, and the other one is doing the work, though, right? And yet we take into consideration the opinion of the one who's not doing the work. Like we said, the rabbis and Rabbi Eliezer both agree about this. This is Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yosi's opinion in Pigul. Well, that's When the intent happens, what's inside? In the temple. That's only for pigul, for lishma. This has nothing to do with outside the temple. Outside the temple, there's completely different rules. Ava b'chutz lo. We don't, right? We're not going to take into consideration the opinion. Now, in this case, the rabbis are going to agree basically with Rabbi Yosi in the end, because they're going to say, we don't learn it from, right? Rabbi Yosi had a different way of doing it, but he's going to say, when we say the intent of the owner is important, that's only in the temple. Outside the temple, it's the intent of the slaughterer. Okay, when we're talking about chullin, there's no connection. Because chutz mipnim lo yalfina. This is a principle we see many times. Can we learn things outside the temple from inside the temple? There's always these debates about it. And that's the debate between Rabbi Eliezer and the rabbis. So the rabbis say, or Tanakama we could call it, says, no, we don't learn what goes on outside from what goes on inside the temple. Va'ata Rabbi Eliezer l'meimar, comes Rabbi Eliezer to say, yalfina chutz mipnim. We do learn chutz mipnim. If in pigul, it's the machshava of the owner, then also here it's the machshava of the owner. Va'ata Rabbi Yosi l'meimar, and then in comes Rabbi Yosi and says, okay, whether you learn pnim from chutz, afilu bifnim nami, even bifnim we don't take into consideration the owner, okay? Because zeh machashev v'zeh oveh lo amrinan, because again, that's the big machloka between Rabbi Yosi and the other two. Rabbi Yosi thinks in pigul it's the intent of the kohen, and the other two think it's the intent of the owner. So he says, whether we learn or whether we don't learn, it doesn't matter. Even inside, we don't take into consideration the owner's opinion. So obviously here we're not going to take it into consideration, and it's totally fine. Okay. Now we're going to leave our sugya for a minute, although it's going to sound similar, but I'm going to point out all the differences between this sugya and the other, and our sugya, and then we're going to see why the Gemara brought this. This is a repeat sugya that we've seen a bunch of times. The Masoret HaShas tells us that, right? That's where you can find where else it appears. It's in Sanhedrin Daf Samach, Ayin Avodah Zarah Lamed Daled, and Zvachim Daf Yud. Okay, so we've seen this already 3 times. Hashochet et habema lizrok dama lavodah zarah ulaktir chaba lavodah zarah. So if you take an animal and you slaughter it, in order to, now remember, there's different actions when you slaughter the animal. You have an intent while you're slaughtering to sprinkle the blood to pour the blood for avodah zarah purposes. So while you're slaughtering, you're not slaughtering it to slaughter for avodah zarah. You're slaughtering it with the intent that I'm going to, right? In our Mishna, the whole question is stam machshevet ovei kochavim, that we want to slaughter animals for idol worship. Here, there's 2 differences. Number 1, you're thinking while you're slaughtering about sprinkling the blood. That's a different action. So this is what's called me'avodah lavodah. You're thinking, mechashvin, me'avodah lavodah. You're thinking during one action about doing something during a different action. Okay, so your avodah zarah thought is not about the shechita. Or laktir chaba lavodah zarah, or either, right, to sprinkle the blood, or to burn the fats for the purposes of the idol. So Rabbi Yochanan, and the other difference is, there's no non-Jew in the picture. This is all a Jew, okay? A Jew is thinking while they're slaughtering the animal for themselves, okay? That I'm going to slaughter this for, I'm going to sprinkle the blood for idols. Rabbi Yochanan amar psula, Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish amar muteret. So Rabbi Yochanan says, this is no good. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish says, Reish Lakish, it's permitted. Okay, let's see why. Rabbi Yochanan amar psula mechashvi me'avodah lavodah. If I'm in one action and I have a thought to do another action, okay, that's effective. My thoughts are effective, meaning I ruin my shechita. Okay, so this is called the shechita for avodah zarah. It works in the temple, and yalfinan chutz mipnim. And now, why does it work in the temple? We know it works in the temple because of pigul. Remember what pigul is? Let's remind you, or for those who never learned it, pigul is while I'm slaughtering the animal, or let's just give that as an example, I have a thought that I'm going to sprinkle the blood beyond its designated time. That's the definition of pigul, that I'm in one action and I'm thinking about a different action that I'm going to do incorrectly, okay? Incorrectly in the particular way that I'm going to do it beyond its designated time. Or while I'm sprinkling the blood, I think I'm going to burn the fats on the altar tomorrow, which is not allowed. So since I have avodah outside the temple, yalfinan chutz mipnim, Rabbi Yochanan says, and we can learn, again, the same idea of learning from outside the temple, from inside the temple. So therefore, if I'm slaughtering an animal to sprinkle the blood for idol worship, with that thought in my head, I'm going to later sprinkle this blood, it's already forbidden to benefit from, okay? This idea that I did it for the intent of idol worship. Reish Lakish amar muteret. Why? Very simple. Okay, it says both things against Rabbi Yochanan. Number one, ein mechashvim avodah lavodah. If I slaughter an animal with the intent to slaughter that animal for the purposes of idol worship, that's one thing. But if I slaughter it with no wrong intent for the slaughtering, but I'm thinking that I'm going to sprinkle the blood for idol worship, that's not effective. It's not effective. Not in the temple, and okay, lo gamrin chutz mipnim. Now, it doesn't work in the temple. In Pigul, it obviously works, okay? But it doesn't work in another case, which we're going to see in a minute, okay? But see, number one, he doesn't think that there's such a concept, and he also doesn't think lo gamrin chutz mipnim. We don't learn outside the temple from inside the temple, so we're not going to learn this from Pigul. V'az du l'ta'amayu. Now they're consistent within their opinions. De itmar, as it was said, shchata lishma lizrok dama shelo lishma. What if I slaughter an animal for its own sake? Meaning, I slaughter it. I have an animal that was designated for a korban ola, and I slaughter it with the intent it's going to be a korban ola. But I have in mind that when I sprinkle the blood, and it's while I'm slaughtering, I think I'm going to sprinkle the blood for shelo lishma, for a shlamim. Okay, I'm going to sprinkle the blood as if it's a shlamim. Okay, why you would do this right is always strange. If my thought about shchita is lishma, okay, forget about why I would ever do this. But if you have an intent, now this is also mechashvim avodah lavodah, right? Except what's the difference? It's inside the temple. Well, guess what? Exact same machloket. Well, we knew that because it said azdu l'ta'amayu. They're consistent with their opinions as appears in this other machloket. Rabbi Yochanan amar psula, Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish amar kshera. So Rabbi Yochanan says the korban is disqualified, and Reish Lakish says it's totally fine. Rabbi Yochanan amar psula mechashvim avodah lavodah v'gamrina mimachshevet pigul. Okay, this time you don't say chutz mipnim because they're both pnim. But since we all know that that's how pigul is defined, the question is, can you learn from pigul to lishma? So he says yes, you can learn from pigul to the issue of lishma, and therefore we learn that mechashvim avodah lavodah. You can have, and that's again, what does it mean you can? You can ruin your korban if you have a thought while you're doing one action about a different action. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish amar kshera, em mechashvim avodah lavodah velo gamrina mimachshevet pigul. So the fact that that exists for pigul, it's for pigul only. We don't apply from pigul even to lishma, even though it's in the temple, right? Last time we had to say we don't learn outside from inside. This time it's even inside to inside, but he's saying we don't learn from pigul to lishma. It's a unique halacha by pigul, not true for anything else. Now they have to say utzricha. Okay, well, if Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish basically say we're not going to learn from pigul, or we are going to learn from pigul, and mechashvim avodah lavodah lo mechashvim, why do we have to say that they said it in both cases? We could have just said one machloket and learned the other. So now we have to explain why we couldn't have learned one from the other. It's kind of obvious. But utzricha di'it mar baha. If we had the first one, which is outside the temple, you would have said baha ka'amar Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. This case, Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish says what he says, mishum dechutz mipnim lo yalfinan, because he says, I'm not going to say, right, avodah lavodah doesn't work, having a thought about one act about a different one, while you're in one act about a different one, because we're not going to learn outside the temple from inside the temple. However, but maybe when it comes to inside the temple, the issue of lishma, maybe in lishma he would learn. And that's why they have to say, no. He thinks there also, there's no disqualification if your thought was about a different action than the one you're actually involved in right now. Now, for the same reason, itmar baha, if you had it only in the second case, you would have said, Rabbi Yochanan. That's where Rabbi Yochanan says, Mechashvim avodah lavodah, because lishma and pigul are very similar because they're both inside the temple. Aval beha, but maybe in our case, you might have thought, Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. Maybe they agree with Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish that you're not going to learn chutz mipnim. And that's why, right, you're not going to learn outside from inside. And that's why it's shricha. That's why you needed to say they argue in both cases. Because you could have made an argument that Reish Lakish would agree with Rabbi Yochanan inside, or that Rabbi Yochanan would agree with Reish Lakish outside. And now we're going to bring a difficulty, and this is the reason why this sugya is here, is because we're going to bring a difficulty both on Reish Lakish and on Rabbi Yochanan from our Mishna. Mativ Rav Sheshet, Amar Rabbi Yosi. So Rav Sheshet comes and says, Rabbi Yosi said the following, right? Kal v'chomer hadvarim. Let's remember, this is just a quote. We already learned this, but let's read it again inside. Ma bimkom shamachshava poseret b'mukdashim, in the place where your machshava ruins things, in the world of kachim, right, sacrifices, And yet, ein hakol holech el achar oved. We don't care what the owner thinks. It's only the one who's doing the action, the Kohen. So makom she'en machshava poselet, so in a place which is more lenient because machshava doesn't ruin it at all, here's going to be the problem. Wouldn't you think then? It would obviously then only go, right? We wouldn't consider at all the owner's intent, right? Where intent is not a factor, how could we consider the owner's intent? Now, it's hard to say the intent is not a factor. Of course, the intent is somewhat of a factor, and that's going to be the problem. There wouldn't be an issue at all if the intent wasn't a factor. What does it mean? There's no intent is not a factor in Chullin. If you're going to say intent never disqualifies an animal outside the temple, any intent for idol worship, well, how could you have a case of slaughtering for the purposes of avodah zarah? We already know, this is what we talked about, the zivchei metim, and this is where Rashi says it, that we learned that zivchei metim, slaughtering for the sake of an idol. Now, what does that mean? If not, I slaughtered it with the intent that I'm slaughtering it for idol worship. I'm going to bring this in front of an idol and offer it up. That's forbidden b'hana'ah as soon as I have that intent. So there's obviously intent that disqualifies in Chullin also. So what is Rabbi Yosi talking about? Elapshita, what must it be? The only way to say, when is intent a factor in the world of kachim and not a factor in the world of Chullin? What kind of intent? Elapshita me avodah la avodah. Get it? The intent that's not a factor in Chullin and is a factor in kachim is specifically this one. Thinking from your intent while you're doing one action, thinking about a different action. Okay? And then we're going to say like this, and this is going to be the problem. What Rabbi Yosi says is, in the world of kachim, any intent during one action is going to, right, while you're doing one action and you think about another action, like I'm thinking while I'm slaughtering, that I'm going to sprinkle the blood beyond the designated time, which is pigul. Or, what else would be in the world of kachim? That while I'm slaughtering it lishma, I think, but I'm going to basically sprinkle the blood lo lishma. Okay? So in the world of kachim, avodah lavodah works, it's effective. But in the world of Chullin, that same parallel case is not effective. Okay? Now, you can already figure out, before we read it inside, neither of those match Rabbi Yochanan or Reish Lakish. Neither of them match this. Because remember, what this is doing is, it's putting the split in between Kodesh and Chullin. Now, basically, if you remember, both of them say, either in Chullin and in Lishma, which is Kodshim, either yes machashvei me'avodah lavodah in both of them, or no machashvei me'avodah lavodah in both of them. But this one splits between the two of them because it's Kodshim on one side and Chullin on the other. And that's why this is going to be a contradiction to both of them. But let's read it inside. So again, my machshava mosela b'Chullin, right? It can't be de lo pasla klal, because then there would be no avodah zarah that would ever be forbidden, and slaughtering for avodah zarah, we know it is. So it must be me'avodah lavodah v'hachi kamar. This is how it should read. Uma b'makom she'machshava posela b'mukudashim me'avodah lavodah. In a case where your machshava ruins things in kodshim, when you're thinking from one avodah to the other, ein hakol olech el achar ha'oved. Now you just have to read the rest of Rabbi Yosi. It's not really so important for our purposes. But in the case of kodshim, when the intent is obviously the one who's doing the avodah, the work in the temple, the kohen, makom she'en machshava posela b'Chullin me'avodah lavodah. In that parallel case in the world of Chullin, where we don't have your machshava me'avodah lavodah, it's not effective. Ela b'ota avodah, the only way it would be effective and ruin things would be within its own avodah. I'm slaughtering for the sake of slaughtering for idol worship. Eino din, so obviously it's more lenient. Eino din shelo yehei hakol olech el achar shochet. So obviously there, wouldn't it obviously then follow the slaughter? So, Pnim kasha Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish and Chutz kasha Rabbi Yochanan. Okay, it would be easier to say it in the words not Pnim and Chutz, but Pnim is temple, right? Mukdashim versus Chullin. So the Mukdashim part is a problem for Reish Lakish, because what does it say? In the temple, it's effective, your thoughts from one to the other. And he said in the Lishma, it's not. And the Chullin case is a problem for Rabbi Yochanan, because here it says, Chullin, there is no machshava, right? It's not effective. And Rabbi Yochanan thinks it is effective. So that's the problem. And that's why we brought this sugya here. Again, I don't want you to get confused. The pnim and all that, and The machashvim avodah lavodah is all one person, there's one owner, right? It's all the same person who's doing it for their own sake, right? They're doing it for the sake of idols, but it's all their korban. It's not like there's two different people, and that was the whole discussion in the Mishnah, the Jew and the non-Jew. Here it's just the Jew, but the point is, Rabbi Yosi's whole argument is based on that there's a kal v'chomer to be set up between Kodesh and Kodesh and Chullin, and that makes no sense according not to Reish Lakish and not to Rabbi Yochanan. So how can we explain this? Bishlama pnim Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish lo kasha. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish is going to be easy, although surprising, but Reish Lakish is going to be easy to resolve. Why? Ha mikame deshami Rabbi Yochanan, ha lebatar deshami Rabbi Yochanan. Because one was stated before he heard from Rabbi Yochanan, meaning our setting up that they have a big machloket between them was all before he heard Rabbi Yochanan's position. Later, when he heard Rabbi Yochanan's opinion, he changed his mind. And this Mishnah, you could say, right? How did Reish Lakish read this Mishnah? Oh, well, that was after he changed his mind. And then the Mishnah makes sense according to Reish Lakish, because in the end, Reish Lakish agreed with Rabbi Yochanan that when it comes to a korban, you're gonna now. What did he agree about? This is important because again, maybe I'll just want to state the problem very clearly. Like I said before, the split in the Rabbi Yosi in the Mishnah is between Chullin and Kodshim, right? All the laws of Kodshim are the same, both Pigul and Lishma, and Chullin is on the other side. That's not where the split went in Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. They both said, right, Chullin and Lishma are the same law. But if we say that Reish Lakish ended up agreeing with Rabbi Yochanan about the temple, then it fits perfectly. In the temple, mechashvim avodah lavodah. In Chullin, no. So Rabbi Reish Lakish apparently agreed with Rabbi Yochanan in the end about the Kodshim case, and thought in the case of Lishma, you have it while you're slaughtering, you think, I'm going to sprinkle the blood for the sake of the wrong korban. Reish Lakish in the end agreed it's disqualified. And then that works. Okay, that fits. But elachutz kasha the Rabbi Yochanan. But how are you going to explain the chutz according to Rabbi Yochanan? Rabbi Yochanan clearly says mechashvim avodah lavodah even in Chullin. So how can you explain it? Well, hu motiv lav v'hu mefarik lav. So Rav Sheshet asked this question, and Rav Sheshet's going to answer it. He's going to understand this whole thing differently. Ba'arba avodot. He's going to say this has to do with the 4 avodot. What are the 4 avodot? Remember, shchita, kabbalah, holacha, and zrika, right? The 4 avodot in the temple. Now, if you remember, we had a whole study in the beginning of Zvachim about how do we know that the disqualification of pigul is whether you have the thought during any of the 4 avodot. Okay, there were psukim to prove that. Any of the 4 avodot, you can have a machshava of pigul. So what's the kal v'chomer now? Hachi kamar. This is how to read it. Uma b'makom shamachshava poselet b'mukdashim ba'arba avodot, ein hakol olech el achar ha'oved. Now the machshava ruins your kodesh, right? Your korbanot in 4 avodot. That gives it a certain chumrah. The chumrah is going to be the 4 avodot against 2 avodot. Okay, you're going to see right now. Because remember, Rabbi Yochanan thinks all these cases are disqualified, even in Chullin. You can have a thought during one avodah to another. So what's he going to say? You're right. For all the cases, it's a problem. But what's the difference? In Kodshim, it's in 4 avodot you can disqualify it, and in Chullin, it's only 2. That's what we're going to see right now. So in the world of Kodshim, machshava ruins it in 4 avodot, and yet here goes the kal v'chomer, ein hakol holech el achar ha'oved, and we still don't care. Right? We don't care there about the owner, even though it's a high level disqualification because it goes on in any of the 4 avodot. Turning now to Amabet. Makom she'en machshava poselet b'chulin ela b'shtei avodot. Now, it's not that ein machshava poselet b'chulin at all. Remember, we started thinking when we read the Mishnah, I just want to show the progress we've made, or the progression here. We started with thinking no machshava ever disqualifies in Chullin. We said that can't be, because of course it does. Hashochet lavodah zarah is a problem, okay? And that's all intent. So you can't say that. So we said, according to Reish Lakish, ein machshava poselet from avodah lavodah. Okay, shchita and shchita, yes. But shchita and thinking about zrika will not. According to Rabbi Yochanan, we're going to say, oh, it is poselet, b'chulin, but not in all 4 avodot, because in Chullin there is no Kabbalah and holacha. Any thought you have about those are irrelevant in the world of Chullin. So it is posel b'chulin, but just not in the same way that is posel in mukdashim. Mukdashim, it's more severe, because in all 4 avodot you're going to have a disqualification. But In this case, it's only b'shtei avodot, so ein odin shelo yehei al kol olech el achar shochet. So because it's got that stringency against the leniency, right? Wouldn't you think in the lenient case, it also isn't going to follow, right? The owner, it must only follow the slaughterer, and it won't be a problem. Okay, and that's how we explain the line in our Mishnah according to both Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. So structurally, what we did was just to review our daf until this point, we started with a Mishnah with 3 opinions. We had 2 different explanations of the Gemara about what exactly the machloket is between them, what each one holds. The 2 options, right? Yesterday we learned one, today we learned another one. Then we brought in a completely different sugi, not completely different, but somewhat different, Jew and Jew, right? A Jew with his own thoughts, her own thoughts, and also 2 different avodot, right? The thought during one about a different. We brought the machloket. We mentioned they say the same thing in a different area. We say, oh yeah, it's the same, and why do you need both then? And then we moved on to say our Mishnah, and that's why we brought it, this line, this one problematic line that Chullin, no machshava is disqualifying. What does that mean? We assumed it meant from avodah lavodah, and then it didn't make any sense, not according to Reish Lakish, not according to Rabbi Yochanan. In the end, we explained it according to each of them. Now we're going to bring a braita that supports Rabbi Yochanan. Tanya kavatei to Rabbi Yochanan. השוחט את הבהמה לזרוק דמה לעבודה זרה ולהקטיר חבה לעבודה זרה, הרי אלו זבחי מתים. If you slaughter an animal with the intent to sprinkle, again, this is exactly Rabbi Yochanan. You slaughter an animal for yourself, right, with the intent to sprinkle the blood at different avodah for idol worship, or להקטיר חבה לעבודה זרה, or to burn the fats for idol worship, הרי אלו זבחי מתים. Okay, if this is zivchei metim, that's what we call it, right? That's forbidden to benefit from. Shchata v'achar kach. Okay, that's it. That's the braita that shows Rabbi Yochanan's position. Michashvi me'avodah l'avodah, it disqualifies. Now the Gemara brings another case. Shchata, okay, this is a whole new sugya, although connected to the previous, not to our Mishnah really, but to the previous. Shchata v'achar kach yishev aleha. If you slaughtered and then you later, okay, this is the machashvi me'avodah l'avodah, but different. This is, I slaughtered it without any intent whatsoever. Then I thought, I'm going to sprinkle the blood. I'm going to sprinkle the blood for idol worship after I finish the slaughtering. So I'm not in the slaughtering anymore. This happened in Caesarea. V'lo amru ba lo isur v'lo hetel. They left this open. They said, it's almost not even leaving it open. They said, we're not going to forbid it, but we're also not going to permit it. Okay, that leaves you kind of in the middle, like, what are you doing? But we're not going to forbid it, we're not going to permit it. So now we want to understand. Amar Rav Chisda, lo amru ba isur mishum kvodan de Rabbanan. Okay, they're going to connect this back to our Mishnah. They didn't say it's forbidden because of the rabbi's position. Now, what's the rabbi's position? We don't assume that an Oved Avodah Zarah is going to do something for Avodah Zarah unless they tell us. Okay? Now, this is a little different because it's a Jew. It's not an Oved Elilim, but on the other hand, it is an Oved Avodah Zarah because in the end, he said, I'm going to sprinkle the blood for idol worship. So the rabbis say, we don't assume, right, maybe, okay, fine, later he did it, but at the point where he slaughtered it, we don't assume that he was doing it for idol worship. Again, he's a Jew, he's not a non-Jew. On the other hand, he's an idol worshiper in the end. And lo heter, but they didn't permit it, mishum kvodo de Rabbi Eliezer, because what did he say? Stam machshevet oved lelim avodah zarah. And if this guy in the end proved to be an idol worshiper, then probably in the beginning he was thinking for idols also, and therefore they didn't permit it. So the Gemara says that's not really a valid comparison. This is a very different case than our Mishnah. You can't compare this. The reason why the rabbis didn't permit or didn't forbid can't really be what you just said. Because mimai, dilma adkan lo ka'amri rabbanan hatam, ela delo shamana de chashiv. Aval hacha de shamana de chashiv, hochiach sofo tchilato. They say, on the one hand, you could say like this. The rabbis in our Mishnah, in the end, the person didn't worship idols, right? We're just saying, do we have to assume some person is doing it for idol worship? This case, actually, the person 5 minutes later said, I want to sprinkle the blood for idol worship. So can't you say that the actions in the end that they did in this act could retroactively prove what they thought in the beginning? So actually, the rabbis who were permitted in the Mishnah might here say this is different because in the end, the person did want to use this animal for idol worship. So maybe you should forbid it. Inami, alternatively, you could say on the flip, maybe Rabbi Eliezer wouldn't actually forbid this because what's the difference? There he was talking about a non-Jew who was an idol worshiper. Because we assume any standard idol worshiper is an idol worshiper and is basically doing their slaughtering for the sake of idols. But by a Jew, until this is like innocent until proven guilty. You're Jewish till you prove you're not going to be Jewish about things. And when you decide to worship idols and become what they call a meshumad and leave the fold because you're saying I'm worshiping idols, we're only going to count it from the moment you do it. We're not going to go before and say, oh, well, 5 minutes before you must have figured to do that. No, it must be at that moment. We're not going to go backwards. At that moment, you're considered a meshumad, but before that, not necessarily. So therefore, this doesn't really relate to Rabbi Eliezer Rabbanan's machloket, okay? Because there's really two differences. One difference is eventually the person actually later with this same animal, they actually did want idol worship. And it's Jew and Jew, not Jew and non, right? It's not Jew, non-Jew. Okay, it's one Jew, him and himself doing the slaughtering. But there's no, right? It's not a non-Jew. So now Rav Shizbi comes and says it wasn't rabbis and Rabbi Eliezer, it was a completely different sugya and a completely different person who we haven't even brought up here. This has to do, the reason why they didn't permit was because out of respect for Rashbag, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. So now the Gemara needs to figure out, okay, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel appears in many machlokot in the Gemara. So in the Mishna, or Tanaitic sources, hey, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, which opinion of Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel are we talking about here? Ilema, now ilema always means if you say they're going to reject this. But let's get into this whole sugya in Gitin. Okay, I want to remind you of a particular thing, which is yibum. Okay, yibum is when a man has no children, his wife, if he dies, no children, his wife is supposed to marry the brother, and if not, they do chalitza. Okay, but it's a whole to-do. There were a lot of sugyas we learned in Gitin where the husband may give the wife a get because he thinks he might die or something like that, and he wants her to be divorced rather than have to do yibum or chalitza, okay? Either he doesn't want her to marry the brother, or he doesn't want her to have to deal with it. He wants her to be free. He wants her to be free to marry anyone she wants and not to have to deal with the whole, chalitza is also a pretty demeaning ceremony. So there are all these situations where people would give a get, like on condition or things, and whether it works or not, right? But there's a whole to-do about that. So we have a case. Now, the other thing is if you send shaliach to give a get to your wife, a man sends shaliach to give a get to his wife, he can do it. But he has to say, you might remember this, kitvu, write the get, and tnu. He has to say and give it to her. If he just says write the get, it's not valid, right? In other words, what does it mean it's not valid? If they wrote the get and gave it to the wife, they weren't acting as his messengers because he never said tnu. Now, there's a few exceptions to the rule. If a guy's about to be taken out on death row and they're about to, execute him, and he says, write a get to my wife, we assume the guy's a little stressed out about getting killed and he forgot to say the words tnu. So in that case, we're going to fill in and say, okay, he obviously meant tnu. And now what has to happen? Well, they have to give the get to the wife when he's still alive. If he dies already, there's no get after death. But if they were to give the get to the wife before he got executed, and there's a few other cases where, Rabbi Shimon Shazuri says even if he's misukan, if he's like on his deathbed, same thing. Okay, there's a few different cases where this will work. If they gave the get before he died, the get is effective. That's the background. So now we have a Mishnah. So Ilem or Rabbi Shimon Gamliel de Gitin, if you're going to say it's this opinion of Rabbi Shimon Gamliel that comes up in Gitin, Ditnan, as it says in the Mishnah, Habari. Now here we're talking about a healthy person, not a sick person on their deathbed, not a person who's about to be executed, but a healthy person. Shamal kitvu get lishti, and says, write a get to my wife. And the messengers went out, wrote the get, and gave it to the wife. He wasn't really serious. He was just trying to lead her on. Now, why was he leading her on? So Rashi says that she'll stop bothering him, telling him, please give me a get so that I don't have to do yibum if you die. And it was annoying him already. So he said, fine, write a get to my wife, just so that the wife would think, okay, it's dealt with. And she'd stop nudging him about it. Okay? So he didn't really mean give the get to my wife because he was healthy. There was no reason he was going to die. But then the Mishnah cites this case. There was a case where there was a healthy person, a healthy man, who said, give a get to my wife. They gave her a get, okay? They wrote it, they gave it to her. And he went up to the roof, and he fell off the roof and died. Amar Rabbi Shimon Gamliel. So Rabbi Shimon Gamliel said, remember, we're looking for an opinion of Rabbi Shimon Gamliel. What did he say? Im matzmo nafal hareza get. If he fell on his own, meaning he jumped off the roof and killed himself, well, that would be a get. Okay, because what is this? Tchilat, right? So fo muchiach al tchilato. The fact that in the end he killed himself, obviously now he might have been healthy, but probably not mentally healthy, but physically healthy. And you didn't see signs of it, but in the end, he committed suicide. It was clear he was trying to give a get to his wife to exempt her from yibum. So the get would be effective. Again, she would have to have accepted it before he died. V'maruach dachato ain't no get. But if the wind blew him off the roof and he just died by accident, then it's not a get, because then there's nothing to indicate. Now, before we explain the obvious, but the Gemara says, but isn't this why are we bringing a case that contradicts the law? The law was, if he says kitvu get, it's not a get. It sounded like no matter what. So they say, this word's missing here in the Mishna, and this is how it should read. Okay, but if in the end his actions prove what he really meant in the beginning, that he really wasn't taunting her, and he really did it to give her the get, then we allow it. Okay, then the get will be a get, and ma'aseh nami. And here's a case that happened, Bibarisha Amar, now we're just going to read it again, Kitvu get lishti, va'alav al-gag, v'nafal v'met, Amar Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, im atzmo nafal areza get, im ruach dachato eino get. Okay, and there you see it. That we can have, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel is saying what the Mishna is saying before he comes in, brings the story. If his end actions prove what he was thinking in the beginning, it's effective. So that maybe is the Rabbi Shimon Gamliel of our case. And that's why they didn't want to permit this, because they said, look, in the end, he worshipped idols, right? He wanted to sprinkle the blood to worship idols, so that would already ruin his shchita. But what's the problem? Remember, this came with an ilema. If you're going to say, you can't compare the cases, because dil mashane hatam de ka'amar kitvu. It's not like the guy didn't say anything here. He said right again. Once he said right again, we could say right meant, just like in those other cases I told you, right meant right and give. It's clear that he actually, at the first, right, if we're talking about a timeline, in the case of the shchita, he just slaughtered an animal. An action that was a completely normal action and nothing to do with idol worship. Later, when he came in and said, oh, I want to sprinkle the blood for idols, it's very hard to go back and say that there was any indicator in the shchita that was what he thought. But this person actually said, right again to my wife. He obviously had something, we have an action and words of his, maybe not an action, but words of his to connect it to what he meant originally. And now we're just interpreting. Kitvu just meant kitvu utnu. That's different. You can't learn from there to our case where you're missing all that. Okay, so we need some other case of Rabbi Shimon Gamliel. Now we're going to get to the case. Ela Amar Ravina, Mishum Kvodod Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel dahacha. It's because of the respect for Rabbi Shimon Gamliel's position here. Titania, braita says, Hakotev nechasav la'achirim v'ayu bahen avadim. So we have someone who's about to die, and they said, I want to give all my possessions not to my children, but to someone else who happens to be a Kohen. So he gives it to his friend, his neighbor, the Kohen. He says, I want to give you all my possessions. And then he dies, and there's slaves within the possessions. Now, the Kohen neighbor doesn't really want slaves. Va'amar hala efshi bahen. He says, thanks, but no thanks, I don't want the slaves. If he was a Kohen, the neighbor here, who got all the property instead of the heirs, if he's a Kohen, the slaves are considered his. We're going to have to explain why. Didn't he say, I don't want it? Why doesn't that work? We'll get back there. But he says, I don't want them. We don't care. The slaves are his, and to the extent that they can even eat truma, which we're not going to really let unless it's pretty clear. So they can eat truma because they belong to a Kohen owner. So they're avadim, right? These are Canaanite slaves. Avad Kohen are allowed to eat truma. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, here comes to the Rabban Shimon Gamliel position. Kevan she'amar hala efshi bahem kvar zachu bahen yorshim. Since the person said, I don't want them, the Kohen, they don't belong to him. They go straight to the heirs. They skip that person. They go straight to the heirs. And then obviously that means they can't eat truma if the heirs are not Kohanim. Now they ask, oh, we don't understand this machloket at all. If the guy's standing there screaming, Mr. Cohen, and he says, no, I don't want these slaves. What, we're going to say they're his? That doesn't make any sense. So I'm a rabbi, the item Rabbi Yochanan, so the Rabbi Yochanan explains, and now we're going to have, okay, they don't argue in this case, they don't argue in that case, there's a middle case they argue about, and then we'll understand the machloket. Bitzavach me'ikara kuleama lo pligi de lo kana. If the person immediately, when he gets the possession, says, Mr. Cohen says, no way do I want this, they're not his. Bishotek uvasof tzavach. What if he was silent in the beginning and then a day later said, thanks, but I don't really want these slaves? You can imagine why someone would want slaves. You have a responsibility. You have to feed them, right? You don't necessarily want that. So if he later, the next day, said, thanks, but no thanks, it's too late. Obviously, he acquired them and they're his. Now, you could do a shiur, you can do all these things, but he didn't do that yet. They're his and they can eat truma. So what's the machloket about? The ownership passed on to someone through a middle person. Now, Rashi says, and the person was, the Kohen, Mr. Cohen was standing there. So there's a lot of times what you could do is zikoi. Someone says, I will accept this on your behalf. So the person died. He said, I'm acquiring the slaves on your behalf. And the guy was silent. Mr. Cohen was standing right there and didn't say a word. And then later said, I don't want them, right? Presumably when they, let's say, were walking into his house. So Tanakama, and then that's the machloket. Tanakama savar midishate kananu. Look, he was silent at the first moment when the person took ownership for him. He was there. He saw what happened. He didn't say anything. Okay, he acquired them. And when he later screams, he changed his mind, but it's too late. Here we go. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says when in the end, when they start coming into his house and he says, I don't want you coming into my house, it proved that he didn't even want them from the beginning. Now you have to explain, why didn't he say anything? Well, why didn't he argue in the beginning, the scream in the beginning? He said, well, they're not yet in my possession. Why should I, right? The other person took ownership for me. They're not yet mine. I'll start screaming when they start coming into my house. So there was no point to scream at that point. And what do you see? Since later he did something, that indicated now. Okay, so that is the Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, and that's why they didn't permit it, because they were worried about maybe we should be concerned for his opinion. That they didn't permit it, they didn't forbid it, because maybe we should be concerned for the other opinion. So because of that, it's this machloket and not the machloket in our Mishnah. Okay, now back to our Mishnah. Well, how do we paskin? Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, halachat ki Rabbi Yosi. We paskin like Rabbi Yosi, that it's the owner's intent, the slaughterer's intent. We don't care about the owner, and therefore there's no problem actually. So if I slaughter an animal on behalf of a non-Jew, it's totally fine. Doesn't matter what he intended, because his intent is not relevant. Now we're going to have two stories, and with that we'll finish. So there were Arab merchants that came to a city, Tzukunya. Yahuv dichre letabachei Yisrael. So the Gentiles came and gave these animals to Jews, these rams. Amru lahu, they said to the Jews, we want you to slaughter our animals. Dam v'tarba l'didan, we want the blood and the fats to give to our idols. Mashka ubisra l'didchu, and you take as your salary the hide and the meat. Shalcha Rav Tuvi bar Rav Matna l'kamei to Rav Yosef, ki agav namai. So Rav Tuvi bar Rav Matna sends to Rav Yosef and says, what do we do? Is this allowed or not allowed? Can we do this? Shalach le, hachi amar Rav Yehuda amar Shmuel, halachak Rabbi Yosi. Yeah, don't you know, Rav Yehuda paskin in the name of Shmuel, we paskin like Rabbi Yosi, it's totally fine. So, in fact, you can do that. But now we're going to end with, Amar le Rav Acha b'rei Rav Avia le Rav Ashi, le Rabbi Eliezer. Okay, so Rav Acha b'rei Rav Avia says to Rav Ashi, according to Rabbi Eliezer, now remember Rabbi Eliezer, he's the stringent position, and says, we take into consideration the owner, and we assume stam avodah zara, right? Ovei l'elilim is for avodah zara. So according to him, not that we paskin this way, but according to him, what would happen in the following case? Yavle zuze letabach Yisrael mai. What if a Gentile walks into a butcher shop of a Jew and says, I'm going to give you some money. I want a piece of that meat that you're going to slaughter. Now, the question is, does he own the meat? In which case, is he the owner and the owner's intent is relevant? And therefore we assume stam for oved avodah zarah. Or does he not own it? Because it's not like the previous case where they gave their animal to the Jew and said, you take as your salary this. They clearly own the meat. Here he's not really the owner, or is he? That's the question. So it's going to be an interesting answer. Amarle, chazina, we look. What do we assess? We assess, inish alamahu. It's all going to depend on, is the person a bully, like a strong bully kind of guy, or not? What does that mean? If the non-Jew is a bully, In what sense do we call him a bully, like a strong person? Delo matze madchile. That if you were to say, I don't want to give this meat to you, take your money back, you can't. He won't let you. Okay. The guy's going to say, give me this piece of meat or I'm going to kill you. Okay. Or something like that. If he's that kind of person that you have no ability to say that, then basically he acquired that piece of the meat because there's no turning back. You can't say, I don't want your money. I'm not interested. If that's the case, he owns part of this meat. So if you slaughter that animal and he just wanted a little piece of it, the whole animal's a problem because it was slaughtered for the intent of that person. And elo, if not, amarle, say to him, reishach v'har. You can smash your head against a mountain, some kind of phrase like that, like take your money and I'm not interested. Okay, so if you can do that, then it's not really owned by him and then it's fine. But if you can't do that, then it's owned by him and then you can't do it. But again, that's only according to Rabbi Eliezer because we don't paskin that. Okay, so we'll start with the next Mishna tomorrow because it's just a little bit on this page. Whole new topic. So anyway, we're now on, not whole new, but okay, we had our Mishnah with 3 different opinions, which kind of broke into 2 or in one camp, one in the other camp about pigul and whether it's the owner or the Kohen that's important, and that affected how we view it here. And then we had 2 different explanations of the machloket. From there, we moved to this machloket. Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish brought Rabbi Yosi's kavachomer in this one particular line in the kavachomer that created a problem. What does it mean? Chullin don't have intent. And then we write, so the machloket again was mechashvim me'avodah lavodah, lo mechashvim me'avodah lavodah, both in Chullin and in lo lishma case. And then, right, do we learn both of them from pigul, none of them from pigul? And then we brought in the Mishnah as a contradiction to both Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, but resolved it. After that, we brought a braita to support Rabbi Yochanan. Then we brought these cases, this case about shachata, and then you had a machshava later. We brought in the whole sugya of desofo mochiach al tchilato, and where we said that they didn't really know what to do, and then we wanted to know why not. We thought it was connected to our Mishnah. In the end, it wasn't connected to our Mishnah. It was connected to the Shrom Shimon Gamliel. So we had to figure out which opinion, not the get case, but yes, the case about the property and the slaves going to somebody else. And then we said that's where mochiach sofo tchilato or not, and that's where they didn't know what to do, and they left it kind of hanging. And then we ended with 2 more cases where we basically said we paskin like Rabbi Yosi, but then they had one case where they really did paskin like Rabbi Yosi, another where they just asked a question, what would Rabbi Eliezer do in this case? Okay, and they said it really depends whether the person, right, whether they acquired it or not, and that depended on whether they were a bully or like a tough guy or not really a tough guy, a pushover. And that affects, which is very interesting, that would affect whether they own the meat or not. And with that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a good day, may it be a safe and a quiet day, and hopefully we'll get back to normal soon.